Hello, and welcome to Odaacity with Ayantu and Siade. Here at Odaacity, we bring you informed and diverse conversations on the most contentious issues. Odaacity is a forum for deliberation, fresh ideas, and critical thinking on current affairs.
Nationalism has to evolve, it has to shift, it has to respond and react to the emerging needs in our community.
The idea of Ethiopia is a becoming project. It's a project that's unfolding, something that can be reconfigured and transformed. Then I don't see any reason why Oromo nationalist discourse should abandon the Ethiopian project.
That was artist, researcher, and community organizer Fayise Abrahim and human rights scholar Awol Allo from the London School of Economics, who joined me for this segment on solidarity and nationalism. The antagonism between Ethiopia's two largest ethnic groups, the Oromo and the Amhara, has been a subject of great interest to scholars, activists, and politicians, particularly over the last 25 years. In the wake of recent protests sweeping across Oromia and the rest of Ethiopia, one of the key points of discussions has become the issue of interethnic solidarity. We've seen images of protesters in places like Gonder and in parts of Oromia showing solidarity with each other. In the aftermath of this growing solidarity, we ask, what does it mean to practice a transnational solidarity in the context of, on the one hand, an authoritarian state ruled by a minority group, and on the other, the existence of antagonistic nationalisms between Ethiopia's two largest groups? That's the general question underpinning our discussion today. The historical antagonism between Oromos and Amharas continues to play out in the present, influencing contemporary Ethiopian politics in significant ways. Recently, Awol Allo, a human rights scholar at the London School of Economics, gave a lecture on this very topic. Awol's main argument is that in order to create the sort of transformational change that needs to happen in Ethiopia, the country's two largest groups must work together. And in order to work together, these two groups must address the antagonisms that continue to exist between them, at least on a discourse level. He says basically that the sort of binary representations of Oromoness and Ethiopianness that are dominant must be explored and challenged. Here's Awol explaining these two competing nationalisms and how they work.
Ethiopianness is a deeply coded and hegemonic notion that amplifies and universalizes a very specific ethno-national culture and identity. And it has always been culturally specific. If you look at the symbols it forms and reflects, the truth values it generates and circulates, the events and moments it celebrates and memorializes, all of these things reveal the particular ethnicity that is at the heart of this universalism. And more specifically, Ethiopianness consists in the Ethiopianization of Abyssinian culture, symbol and way of life. Not a reflection of universal attributes and symbols that are valid across that diverse nation, that diverse culture that constitutes the Ethiopian state, but the universalization of culturally specific values and interests. So what is often called Ethiopian nationalism or pan-Ethiopian nationalism is not really a non-exclusivist, tolerant civic nationalism with cosmopolitan aspiration, as its name suggests. It's Amhara nationalism, or Southern Amhara nationalism to be more specific. Ethiopianness has always presented itself as a discourse of truth, a truth independent of power and politics, just like Americanness or Britishness, or Englishness or Scottishness. It's an essentialist notion that claims to represent an absolute and timeless truth about the people and the polity that it speaks about. It claims to have a natural attribute, grounded in nature and in a stable foundation, a foundation that claims to have been constituted out of the totality of the social bodies and the practices that constitute the Ethiopian state, but in actuality reinforces simply the privilege of a particular ethnic group. Theoretically, the Oromo is an integral part of an inclusive Ethiopian social body, but in practice, it forms what Rancière calls the part of those who have no part. What that means is that these are communities who can speak, but whose voices are heard as a noise, not as a discourse. Those who have bodies, but whose bodies are invisible and unrecognizable as speaking bodies or as speaking beings. and those whose claims and accounts of themselves are incapable of understanding, and they are often miscounted, and when they are counted as a miscount. And Oromoness is a strategic knowledge formulated and deployed by this new Oromo subject who began to speak in history. A new subject who began to speak of rights, laws, justice from his or her point of view, according to their lived experience as an Oromo. If an injustice is committed against you, precisely because of the particular identity or the particular social group that you belong to, your response must be on the basis of that identity which is the subject of an attack. So Oromoness basically operated along this line. It's a strategic knowledge of the past that deploys this knowledge as a counterpower to wrench the narrative from the hands of Ethiopianness. In some ways, it is a liberationist counter-history, if you like, interested in the struggle for the control of narratives and the means of narrative production. As a counter-knowledge and as counter-discourse, Oromoness marks the insurrection of subjugated historical knowledges of the Oromo past, a discourse that reactivates those local knowledges of subjugation and conquest, knowledges that are local and regional but present in the system's functional ensembles. Precisely because of their presence in the system's functional ensembles, they are incapable of anonymity. They exist, right, but they don't have the kind of visibility that state discourse has. So these are both historically generated and socially constructed. Precisely for that reason, they cannot be inherently good or inherently bad. Ethiopianness has been state discourse for over a century, and depending on your reading of history or which history you accept, it has not become an inclusive and egalitarian form of nationalism. Oromoness, as I said, is a subversive discourse, subversive nationalism, and there is no guarantee that it will achieve these intended goals of realizing an egalitarian and just society. There's simply no guarantee. And I think one of the central weaknesses of Oromuma or Oromoness is the fact that it's sort of solely defined itself vis-a-vis the Ethiopianist discourse. In my view, a little too much. And it has not been able to make a positive case for Ethiopia. It's sort of abandoned the idea of Ethiopia, basically. So between this universality that is claimed by Ethiopianness and the particularity that characterizes Oromoness, there is a fundamental opposition. Oromo and Amhara elites have been arguing over the meaning and content of national unity for the last 2 decades.
Now that you have a bit of context on the historical antagonisms between Oromos and Amhara, and the nationalism that has developed out of that relationship, we present you the rest of the conversation with Fayise and Awol, where we discuss the challenges of talking critically about nationalism, the pain of marginality, how women talk of resistance and oppression in different ways, and finally, why solidarity, and not the often thrown around term unity, is the more fruitful path for Ethiopia's politics. Why is it important right now to be talking about the limits of nationalism at this critical time in Ethiopian history, at a time when people all over the country are raising up against an authoritarian regime and state violence? Why are we talking about nationalism?
One important reason why it is important to sort of go beyond discussions about solidarity into these nationalist narratives is precisely because charting the way for the future requires a very strong vision in which everyone feels represented, in which everyone can sort of see themselves, their values and ways of being and acting reflected. You can't do that without really going back and, sort of accounting for that past. In some ways, allow the community as well to have a means of processing the past. One of the reasons why the kinds of oppressive relationship that exists in Ethiopia thrived over the course of the last 20 years is precisely because of a certain role nationalism played, or a certain strand of nationalism played. Particularly the antagonism between the Oromos and the Amharas and the ways in which the ruling party sort of strategically mobilized that antagonism between the two groups so that the two groups will not have a common language with which they can come together, have a conversation to sort of chart out a better future for the country. So I think talking about nationalism is critical in terms of bringing those two communities together. These two groups who are rising up right now have no common vision for the future. The only thing that brought them together is these shared grievances, shared abuses that has been meted out to both of them by this regime for the last 25 years. But shared grievances in of themselves are not sufficient. They can't provide you with enough raw material to work towards sort of a new community, a new nation that would respond to some of the problems that people are rising up against at the moment.
So a lot of your talk was focused on the sort of changes that need to happen in Ethiopia. You say that the diaspora cannot do the sort of robust work needed to bring forth a new ethical and moral consensus in Ethiopia. But on a discourse level, the diaspora has had immense power in continuing the binary of Ethiopianness and Oromoness that you speak of. Do you see any connection between the work that has to be done on the ground in Ethiopia and the one that the diaspora has to do to break that binary?
My point actually was that the kinds of contestations, historical contestations and disagreements between Oromos and Amharas, broadly speaking, are epistemic in nature. These are debates over certain historical events that were inscribed into the historical archives in particular ways. So it has a lot to do with the ways in which knowledge is produced, circulated, and set to work in the social body. We can have these debates outside Ethiopia between elites, but the only way, I think, in which we can move towards some kind of ethical consensus, some kind of epistemic consensus, is if we have a democratic space that enables people to participate in that conversation at different levels, including people at the grassroots level. The kind of conversation that would allow us to reconsider, the we of the Ethiopian state, a conversation that is robust enough as to allow everyone to have a say, including those whose views are, excluded altogether from mainstream perspectives. By this, I don't necessarily mean the Oromos, but people of South, for example, whose views don't really count much, even today. So I think it's precisely for that reason that I made the claim that we cannot solve these kinds of epistemic disagreements from abroad, that we need a democratic, pluralistic space that allows conversations around these issues in every sector of society, including in academia, student curriculums, in our arts and culture. We need that kind of space.
Fayise, what do you see as the work that the diaspora has to do in order to address the very adversarial sort of relationships, at least on a discourse level, that exists between different ethnic communities that come from Ethiopia?
For me, I feel like I bring a perspective, a very odd perspective, because one, my mom is Amhara, right? My dad's Oromo. And I grew up in rural Minnesota, in this town of all of these refugees from all over the world. So I grew up with Gambela, Anwak, Oromo, Amhara, Eritrean people, mostly factory workers that were displaced. Before that, they were farmers. I see the limitations of diaspora. I also see the creative possibilities and the endless possibilities of what diaspora can do. When people come here, they don't just cut off their ties. They're still sending money, they're still connected, they're still bringing family. I mean, in Minnesota alone, there's over 10,000 Oromo people. So what kind of privileges are there in terms of advantages do we have by being diaspora? And what opportunities are we missing if we're not connected in a way that makes sense to support this push for democracy. At the end of the day, folks in the diaspora have to stay connected to the conversation on the ground in Ethiopia, right? So they need to listen. They need to kind of take that leadership. They have to center that leadership on the ground in Ethiopia first. And then from there, look into where do we place ourselves in supporting this moving forward. But it's really that kind of, because of that kind of the privileges that you have being in the West in certain ways, we really cannot also displace people because we are in the diaspora, if that makes sense. I really see it as we have to create a somewhat of a connection, an ethical relationship to our country of origin, even though we are no longer citizens there, or we have dual citizenship. So it's not necessarily that we can disconnect ourselves. So I think I want to see more of those creative approaches, more of those like women-run and you know, kind of women-led solutions as well, because I think also there's a lot of invisible women who are doing a lot of work to keep people alive, but they're not necessarily the ones who you see or you hear. So I kind of feel that that's also not documented. And I feel like they have also a strong role in pushing for a democratic state, right? For me, Oromo-ness is about kind of resistance, but it's also about invisibility. My entire life is kind of this, you're Amhara first, you're Oromo second, or never. And it's kind of that way for women as well. And I even noticed that when I first start to talk about history, with trying to center women's ways of talking about history, all the men show up. I've noticed this over and over again. So it's kind of, to me, like, what does democracy really mean? How does voice hold different weight? And in what ways can we really find all the creative ways of building with each other?
You know, one of my biggest frustrations with the diaspora is the invisibility of women, despite the fact that we know that women are doing a lot of really important work in our communities. Fayise, do you find that women talk about nationalism, oppression, and resistance differently?
And I do not speak for all Oromo women, but the community that I grew up with, like I said, it was a lot of displaced African women. So I grew up with Anwak people, Gambela people, Oromo people, Eritrean people, all of us kind of living on top of each other. I noticed with the women, they tend to focus on kind of the basic human rights first, right? Food, shelter, these kinds of things that they're always organizing themselves, figuring out how they can kind of have a community insurance program. Who goes to take care of who when someone is sick or can't work, or right? So they kind of have these informal networks of kind of like sustenance. And I noticed with men, their language is a little bit more hyper-militarized. And some women tend to be less militaristic in their language. That's something actually I'm challenging myself in as someone who's a community-based organizer. If you think about organizing language, it's like, what do you say? You say your base building, your struggle, your front line, your opponents, your target. It's very militaristic language. And I'm thinking about how much trauma we hold as a community, intergenerational trauma, and how a militaristic response is not necessarily doing the transformative organizing we need to kind of have collective frameworks for healing. Which really, what I see the response to trauma is always this nostalgic grasp of some kind of right mythical history. That's just not true, because you've lost, like, you've had your personhood ripped from you. So what do you hold on to? So I kind of see women creating different worlds. And I think that's what moves me as a writer. I'm thinking more about what is the alternative languages that we can use, and kind of what can we learn from women who are building those other approaches.
The conversations that I've had with a diverse range of Oromo women really lead me to believe that we do talk about oppression differently. I think we also talk about, we tend to talk more about what hurts. And I think these exclusionary discourses hurt. I remember when I was in undergrad, we had these really weird conflicts. For a cultural night at the university, the Oromo students wanted to have like their own set of time allotted for Oromo music. There's tons of different kinds of Oromo music, and they felt that just being pushed under the Ethiopian umbrella and given like one song didn't really do them justice. So that became a whole conflict, and the Oromo students were sort of seen as being divisive, and what I didn't know then that I know now is that, you know, the anger and the frustration is about pain. It's about trauma. It's finding yourself again on the periphery, in the diaspora. What I remember in that experience was the way the women responded versus how the men responded. For the men, it was really all about, let's just create our own thing. Forget these people. Why should we go at it with them? But for the women, I think it was about having those conversations about like why this particular incident is really painful and how we can move past it. I want us to shift a little bit towards talking about solidarity. Awol, in your talk, you argue for the type of solidarity, and I'm using your word here, that insists on the strengths of weak ties. Could you elaborate on this? What does this mean, and how is this sort of solidarity that you have in mind different from the idea of unity or quote-unquote oneness that we've heard regarding Ethiopia for decades?
One of the key problems in the Ethiopian context, in terms of how people imagine the possibility of working together, is the tendency to confuse solidarity with the question of unity, specifically national unity. And the kinds of issues that people demand when they talk about national unity or this idea of oneness is basically people abandoning their identities, their claims, and becoming one. So by unity, what they mean is really uniformity, right? In terms of your ways of expression, your claims against the system or against another group, for example, or in terms of your future political status. What I am trying to propose is that we should insist on sort of tying together without, or coming together without undoing our differences. That's what I call weak ties. Everyone can keep their identities, their claims as it is, but still can work together. When we do that, we'll be able to unlock the energy of the collective, this energy of the interethnic community, which in this particular instance is capable of bringing about a transformative change in the Ethiopian context. The Oromos and Amharas constitute close to 70 to 75% of the Ethiopian population. So the potential to bring about transformative change is immense, given the population size of these two populations. So if we are to move away from this unnecessary conditions and demands about accepting the question of unity or abandoning certain claims that Oromo have, for example, then we can move forward on an idea of solidarity that insists on weak ties, because there is strength in weak ties. If you are to insist on that kind of unity, uniformity, then you will not be able to move forward to do anything for that matter, let alone bringing about transformative change. But if you accept a form of solidarity that doesn't seek to undo people's differences, then you will create a condition of possibility, a space where people can come together and chart the way towards a better future. If you can't do that, then you are back to square one, to the same kind of unhelpful discussions around why everyone should accept Ethiopian unity, how Ethiopian unity has been about modernization, transformation, unification, all of that. Not everyone is loyal to the idea of unification, and that idea of unification or Ethiopianness didn't really recognize and accept quite a significant part of the Ethiopian social body. So to insist that people have to accept those terms to be Ethiopian or to participate in any Ethiopia project in the future would only undermine the prospect for what I try to describe as a progressive change and transformation.
I agree with Awol. I think that unity is really, it can get in the way of solidarity. There's a bulldozing of differences, and we see that a lot happening everywhere. And there's really no such thing as unity, right, when there's inherent power dynamics. Yeah. I think part of the colonial logic is to homogenize people and the land, right? So maintaining that biodiversity, you know, the differences culturally, politically, our worldviews is such an important part of, I would say, doing the preservation needed to kind of advance as a community. But when it comes to solidarity, I also think about environmental issues, and I also think about ecological issues, and kind of similar. I mean, we're living in globalization right now, so there's this constant shift of community. There's a very transient nature of place where people are located and what people's lived experiences are, and I think identities are getting more and more complex every day, every decade. So there needs to be a way of having that kind of strong sense of what does it mean to preserve history and cultural identity, and then at the same time to recognize the challenges that comes with displacement, right? So a lot of people are being pushed from rural areas to metro areas, and then what happens when they're in metro areas? Just seeing that those differences, for example, when you're in Addis, the Gatar folks, and then the people from the area who've grown up there and are used to that. So within the same, it's just hard because within the same region, you're going to have so many differences between people from the same region. So it's almost like, how do we also not get just too trapped in a very particular issue, but we're intersectional, right? So I'm thinking intersectionality. I'm thinking of having multiple identities. And most people who are at the intersections of a lot of identities tend to be marginalized even more. But they also have a lot of frameworks for building solidarity, not unity, but solidarity, and kind of having these engaging these difficult processes. But it has to happen, it has to coincide, right? So while we're preserving our differences, we have to also look at what are our shared economic kind of conditions, what is our shared class conditions. And for me, the most powerful solidarity I've seen is when people have shared conditions and are surviving and revolting against those conditions in a way that makes sense for their own self-interest and their own power, right? They're building power. Transference of power doesn't just happen by asking. So it's kind of, it's both and, you know, it's not, I don't think unity is the answer. At the same time, I feel, from what I've seen globally, there's a lot of similar parallel things happening, especially as we have more transnational corporations coming in and more displacement of people. So to me, I see kind of history coming from the bottom as actually kind of a revolutionary process, because it's a time when we really have to negotiate what is it, how are we examining our past? And so I would just say that, especially on a global scale, there's a lot to learn from indigenous communities doing building across ethnic groups. For example, in Mexico, southern Mexico, I was out there. I literally had to hike. I had no access to anything. But one of the main things they taught me in rural Mexico, closer to Chiapas, was that we are not the same group of people. As indigenous people, do not clump us together. We are not homogenous. Like, our cultural practices, our cultural worldviews, our histories clash. They contradict each other. We must maintain that level of diversity. We must remember and truly understand each other's history so that we can actually really come to terms with what has passed, right? So there's kind of this, I'm noticing this is kind of a privilege you have as an Amhara person, right? I'm half Amhara, is that it's easier to ignore that. It's easier to ignore that part and just talk about how we're united. And just talk about, here's all the different cultural dances. Let's celebrate multiculturalism, but let's not actually have a deeper conversation. So I feel like that is kind of the real challenge that we're working through. And what I see here in a Western context is because we're facing institutional racism, right? As Black people in the U.S., it does, at the end of the day, when a police officer walks by you, whether you're Oromo or whether you're Amhara or whatever, they're coming for you and they're coming for your kids. So there's kind of also this other layer of complexity of added oppression that is shared. So it's kind of where does conflict generated, folks who come from conflict generated diaspora, how is it that we have to survive together? And I've seen a lot of mothers do that. I've seen a lot of aunties do that. they have a kind of politics of survival with each other.
This is exactly the moment, I think, in Ethiopia, for us to be talking about and articulating precisely the kind of solidarities that would work. It is possible that we can create an Ethiopia that, over the course of time, comes up with certain ideas, certain democratic values that are common to all of us, to everyone that lives within that state, provided that there is equality of opportunities for everyone, respect towards one another, and a system in which communities would have a political and economic influence that is commensurate with their demographics and with the overall contribution they make to the country. If we have that kind of system, democratic one, when individual freedom is protected or people's collective cultural rights are protected, I can't see any reason why certain values will not emerge over the course of time around which we can unite.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Odaacity. We know there's much left to be said about the topics we touched upon. On the challenges posed by antagonistic nationalisms, on the complicated relationship between home and diaspora, on the role of gender in nationalism, and on the intricacies in practicing solidarity in the context of deeply divided communities. We want you to know that we intend to keep exploring these themes here at Odaacity, focusing in particular on individual lived experiences, exploring how, as individuals, we navigate these huge forces. Thank you to Awol and Fayise for generously sharing their time with us. And a special thanks to Dresa Ademo for helping produce this episode. If you have ideas for the show and or suggestions for guests you'd like to hear, please let us know. You can email us at theodaacity@gmail.com. We're also on Facebook and Twitter at the Odaacity Podcast. Odaacity is brought to you by Dagali Media and the Underground Media Collective.